There is a river in Yellowstone that runs cold and clear through a valley that elk have crossed for thousands of years. For generations, the same herds moved the same routes, waded the same shallow crossings, grazed the same meadows on the far bank. The rhythms of that landscape seemed fixed, ancient, as reliable as the mountains themselves. And then the wolves came back, and everything changed. Not in a day, not in a season, but gradually, over years of watching and waiting and running and dying, the elk of Yellowstone began to move differently. They began to choose different crossings, avoid different bends in the river, linger in different stands of trees. The landscape itself began to shift in response. Willows grew tall along banks that had been stripped bare for decades. Beavers returned. Songbirds nested where none had nested in living memory. And at the center of all of it, shaping and reshaping the lives of thousands of animals through nothing more than the cold mathematics of predator and prey, was a single wolf pack and the territory they carved out along the northern range of Yellowstone National Park. This is the story of how scientists figured out that wolves were changing not just the behavior of elk, but the physical path of a river. And it begins, as so many great stories do, with a question so simple it almost seems foolish to ask. If you enjoy stories like this one, the kind that pull back the curtain on nature's hidden mechanics, then make sure you hit subscribe before we go any further. There is so much more to explore, and you will not want to miss what comes next. The question was this: why do elk avoid certain parts of the river that look, to any human observer, perfectly safe? That question would take researchers years to answer properly. It would require tracking collars, GPS data, aerial surveys, vegetation transects, riverbank measurements, and thousands of hours of direct observation. It would pull in ecologists, behavioral biologists, hydrologists, and wolf experts from across the world. And the answer, when it finally came together, would force scientists to rethink some of their most basic assumptions about how predators shape the landscapes they live in. But to understand what the wolves changed, you first need to understand what Yellowstone looked like before they came back. By the middle of the 20th century, the wolf had been gone from Yellowstone for roughly 70 years. The last wolves in the park were killed in the 1920s, part of a systematic predator elimination campaign that swept across the American West. At the time, the logic seemed straightforward. Wolves killed elk. Elk were valuable. Therefore, wolves were a problem to be solved. And so they were killed, poisoned, and eventually eliminated entirely from the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. What nobody fully appreciated at the time was what the elk would do in their absence. Without wolves, elk behavior changed. It seems obvious in retrospect, but at the time, it was not something anyone was watching closely. With no predators to fear, elk began to behave in a way that ecologists now call predator-relaxed grazing. They moved more slowly. They stayed longer in the same spots. They grazed more completely, cropping vegetation down to the roots. They congregated in the most convenient, most accessible places: the flat valley floors, the gentle riverbanks, the open meadows where the grazing was easy and the walking was soft. The rivers took the worst of it. Elk grazed the willows and aspens and cottonwoods that once lined the banks of the Lamar River and the Yellowstone River, and a dozen smaller streams throughout the park. Without the deep root systems of those riparian plants to hold the banks together, the rivers began to change shape. They widened and shallowed. They meandered more. The banks eroded. The water temperature rose because there was less shade. The invertebrate populations that trout depend on declined. The beaver populations collapsed because there were no willows left to build with or eat. And without beaver dams, the wetlands that beavers create dried up, taking with them the songbirds and amphibians and insects that depend on that wet, complex habitat. The ripple effects ran through the entire ecosystem, all because the elk, free from fear, had grazed the riverbanks bare. This is what ecologists call a trophic cascade, a chain of effects that runs from the top of the food web all the way to the bottom, from the apex predator to the bedrock. And Yellowstone, in the decades following wolf extirpation, became one of the most dramatic examples of what happens when you pull the top predator out of a system and let everything else run unchecked. But this was not fully understood until the wolves came back. The reintroduction happened in 1995 and 1996. 14 wolves were captured in Canada and released into Yellowstone in January 1995. Another 17 followed the next year. Scientists watched closely. The wolves formed packs. They established territories. They began to hunt. And within a remarkably short period of time, the ecosystem began to respond. The first pack to establish itself in the northern range, the part of Yellowstone most critical to the elk population, was the Druid Peak Pack. They moved into the Lamar Valley, one of the most productive and closely watched sections of the park, and almost immediately, the elk began to change their behavior. The initial changes were behavioral, not physical. Elk started moving more. They stopped spending long hours in the open valley bottoms where wolves could run them down easily. They began using the edges of forests more frequently, places where they could retreat quickly into cover. They paid more attention to the wind, they watched the ridgelines, they moved in tighter groups, more vigilant, ears constantly swiveling. These were the obvious changes, the ones any observer could see within the first year or two of the reintroduction. But the subtler changes took longer to measure, and the most surprising change of all had to do with the river. To understand it, you need to spend some time thinking about how a wolf hunts an elk in river terrain. A wolf is fast, but an elk is faster over open ground. An adult elk can sustain speeds that most wolves cannot match for long distances. The wolf's advantage lies in endurance, in terrain, and in numbers. A pack of wolves will run an elk for miles, cutting off escape routes, taking turns leading the chase, exploiting any physical weakness in the prey. And the terrain matters enormously. Wolves do their best hunting in conditions that favor persistence over speed, in deep snow, in broken terrain, in places where the elk cannot reach full gallop. A river crossing is one of the most dangerous moments in any prey animal's life. The water slows you down, it disrupts your footing, it limits your ability to accelerate quickly. If a wolf pack can push an elk into a crossing at the wrong moment, or catch one in midstream, the odds shift dramatically in the wolf's favor. Elk learned this. Not as a reasoned thought, not as a conscious calculation, but through the ancient, accumulated wisdom of prey animals that had evolved alongside predators for millions of years. The instinct was already there, buried under 70 years of complacency. The wolves simply woke it up again. And as the elk began to avoid certain sections of river, the vegetation along those banks began to come back. This is the part of the story that researchers like William Ripple and Robert Beshta spent years documenting. Starting in the early 2000s, they began systematically measuring vegetation along the banks of rivers inside and outside wolf territories within Yellowstone. What they found was striking. In places where wolves regularly hunted, where their presence was consistent and the elk knew it, the willows and aspens and cottonwoods were recovering, growing taller, spreading. The banks were stabilizing. The shade was returning. In places where wolves were absent or rarely present, the overbrowsing continued. But measuring the vegetation was only the beginning. The more challenging task was figuring out exactly which parts of the river the elk were avoiding, and why. Not every bend, not every crossing, not every section of bank was treated the same way by the elk. The avoidance was not uniform. It was patchy, specific, and in some cases seemingly counterintuitive. Elk would avoid a section of river that looked open and easy to cross, while using a section nearby that looked much more difficult. Why? The answer had to do with the geometry of risk. It was not enough to know that wolves were present in a general sense. The elk were making much finer calculations. They were assessing specific crossing points, not just for the physical difficulty of the crossing, but for the sight lines available on both sides, for the distance to cover on the far bank, for the likelihood of being trapped against the water if attacked mid-crossing, for the ways in which the topography of each particular bend either amplified or reduced the advantage of a pursuing predator. Researchers began to map this in detail. They used GPS collar data from both wolves and elk to reconstruct exactly where each species spent its time, where they overlapped, where they avoided each other, and how those patterns related to specific geographic features of the landscape. The data ran into millions of location points. Processing it required serious computational analysis, and what emerged from that analysis was a picture of extraordinary complexity. The elk were not simply avoiding the river, they were avoiding specific sections of the river, based on a remarkably sophisticated, if entirely instinctive, assessment of predation risk at each particular location. And the wolf pack, the Druid Peak Pack in particular during its peak years in the late 1990s and early 2000s, had a hunting range and a set of hunting habits that interacted with the landscape in ways that made certain river sections far more dangerous for elk than others. The Lamar River runs roughly east to west through the Lamar Valley before turning north and eventually joining the Yellowstone River. It has numerous crossing points, some shallow and gravelly, some deeper and faster. The Druid Peak Pack established their core territory on the north side of the valley, denning on the rocky slopes above the river. Their hunting patterns were not random. Like all wolves, they learned the landscape intimately over years of use. They learned which routes elk used. They learned which crossing points funneled prey into positions of disadvantage. They learned how to position themselves to cut off escape routes. And the elk, watching and learning and dying in the process, learned it back. Over time, this mutual learning produced a spatial pattern. Elk shifted their primary crossing points away from the sections of river closest to the Druid pack's core territory. They began using crossings further downstream, crossings that required longer travel, but offered better sightlines and quicker access to escape terrain on both sides. The change was gradual. It took years to show up clearly in the data, but once researchers began looking for it, it was unmistakable. And here is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. Because the elk were not just changing which crossings they used. By concentrating their crossings at certain points and abandoning others, they were changing the physical structure of the river. At the crossings elk now favored, the repeated passage of hooves began to affect bank structure. At the crossings they abandoned, vegetation recovered, bank stability increased, and in some cases, the physical channel of the river began to narrow slightly as root systems consolidated the banks. This process was slow, measured in years and decades rather than months. But it was measurable, and it meant that the wolves, through nothing more than the fact of their existence and their hunting habits, were influencing the physical geography of the river. This is the concept that came to be known, somewhat grandly, as the wolves changing the rivers. When journalist and author George Monbiot described it in a widely shared 2013 essay and accompanying video narration, it captured the public imagination in a way that few ecological stories had managed before. The idea that predators could reshape not just the behavior of prey, but the physical landscape was deeply compelling. It felt like a revelation, and in many ways it was. But the science behind it was also more complicated than the popular version suggested. And that complexity is worth sitting with, because it is where the real depth of this story lives. Not everyone in the scientific community agreed on the extent to which the wolves alone were responsible for the vegetation recovery seen in Yellowstone after 1995. Some researchers argued that climate variability, particularly changes in precipitation and drought patterns during the reintroduction period, played a significant role in the vegetation changes. Others pointed out that elk populations had been reduced by hunting outside the park, by severe winters, and by other factors that had nothing to do with wolf predation. The question of how much of the change to attribute to the wolves, specifically, and how much to other concurrent factors became one of the most actively debated questions in the ecology of large carnivores. Ripple and Beshta stood by their core findings, but were careful in their language. They described the effects as consistent with a trophic cascade, not as definitive proof that wolves alone caused everything that followed. Other researchers came at the same data from different angles, some finding strong support for the cascade hypothesis, others finding the effects more limited or geographically patchy than the popular narrative suggested. What this scientific back and forth produced, over the following decade and a half, was something much more nuanced and ultimately more interesting than either the simple triumphalist story of wolves fixing a broken ecosystem or the skeptical counter-narrative that dismissed the cascade effects entirely. What emerged was a picture of an ecosystem responding to the return of a predator in ways that were real, measurable, and significant, but also contextual, variable, and dependent on a web of interacting factors that no single study could fully capture. The river crossing story became one of the clearest and most specific examples within this broader debate, because unlike the diffuse question of how much willow recovery was attributable to wolves versus drought versus reduced elk numbers, the crossing behavior data was precise. It was tied to specific locations, specific pack territories, specific GPS-tracked individuals. It was the kind of data that could be analyzed at a fine spatial scale and compared directly to predator activity. And that data told a clear story. The Druid Peak Pack, during the years of their dominance in the Lamar Valley, created a landscape of fear that was not uniform across the valley floor. It had a spatial structure, a geography of danger that was denser in some places and thinner in others. And elk responded to that geography with a precision that researchers found remarkable. They were not simply scared, they were spatially smart about being scared. This is sometimes called the landscape of fear, a term coined by behavioral ecologists Joel Brown and Bert Kotler in a different context, but applied powerfully to the Yellowstone wolf elk system. The landscape of fear is essentially a map of perceived predation risk across a habitat, and prey animals maintain remarkably detailed, constantly updated internal maps of this kind. They know which parts of their range are dangerous and at what times of day. They know how risk changes with weather, visibility, season, and the recent behavior of predators they have observed directly or detected through scent or tracks. The elk in the Lamar Valley were not reacting to wolves in general. They were reacting to the Druid pack specifically, to their particular territory, their particular hunting habits, their particular movement corridors. When the Druid pack was strong, numerous, and actively hunting the valley floor, elk avoidance of the dangerous river sections was most pronounced. When the pack went through periods of decline, disease, or territorial disruption, the landscape of fear shifted. Elk responded, cautiously and gradually, by relaxing their avoidance somewhat. The vegetation recovery slowed. The dynamic was never static. This responsiveness of prey behavior to the specific composition and activity of the predator population is one of the most important findings to come out of long-term predator-prey research. It means that you cannot simply say, wolves affect elk behavior as if both categories were homogeneous. The specific wolves matter. The specific elk matter. The terrain matters. The history of interactions matters. The story is always particular. And Yellowstone has given researchers an extraordinary opportunity to study that particularity, because the monitoring has been continuous and intensive for nearly 3 decades now. No other wolf prey system in the world has been watched this closely for this long. The database of collar locations, kill sites, pack compositions, breeding records, elk population counts, vegetation surveys, and river measurements that has accumulated since 1995 is without parallel in wildlife science. What that database has allowed researchers to do is track not just the effects of wolves on elk, but the way those effects change over time as the wolf population itself changes. And the history of Yellowstone's wolf pack since 1995 has been anything but simple. The Druid Peak pack began with just 2 wolves, a male and a female, released into the Lamar Valley. By 2001, it had grown to 37 animals, making it one of the largest wolf packs ever recorded anywhere in the world. At that size, it was a dominant force across the northern range. Its hunting pressure on elk in the Lamar Valley was intense. The landscape of fear it created was at its maximum extent. But pack dynamics are volatile. Internal strife, disease, competition from neighboring packs, and the inherent difficulty of feeding large numbers of animals in a fixed territory all take their toll. The Druid pack began to fragment. Wolves split off, formed new packs, were killed by rivals or by humans outside the park boundary. By the late 2000s, the Druids were in steep decline. They essentially ceased to exist as a functioning pack by around 2010. The effects on the Lamar Valley were measurable. As the Druids declined, elk use of the valley floor increased. The rate of vegetation recovery slowed in some sections. At some of the river crossings that elk had been avoiding most strongly, there was a gradual, cautious return of elk activity. The landscape of fear was being redrawn. But by then, new packs had moved into parts of the northern range. The Molly's pack, the Black-tailed Deer Plateau pack, the Junction Butte pack. Each established their own territories, their own hunting patterns, their own relationships with the elk of the northern range. The landscape of fear that the Druids had created was gone, but it was replaced by something different, something more complex and spatially varied, as multiple packs with overlapping ranges created a mosaic of risk rather than a single dominant zone of danger. For the elk, this was a new kind of challenge. Instead of learning to avoid one pack's territory, they were navigating multiple overlapping risk zones, each with their own particular characteristics. Researchers noted that elk movement patterns in the post-Druid years were in some ways more difficult to predict. The simple, strong spatial signal of Druid territory avoidance gave way to a more complex, variable pattern of risk assessment across the valley. And through all of this, the river kept responding. The willows that had begun to grow back along the avoided sections of the Lamar River during the Druid Peak pack's dominance continued to grow, even as the specific patterns of elk avoidance shifted. This is because vegetation recovery, once started, has its own momentum. Willows that reach a certain height become harder to browse, their upper branches out of elk reach, their root systems too established to kill by grazing alone. The banks they stabilized stayed stabilized. The shade they provided continued to cool the water beneath them. Beaver, which had essentially vanished from Yellowstone's northern range by the time of the wolf reintroduction, began to return in the mid-2000s. They found willows. They built dams. The dams backed up water, creating ponds and wetlands. The wetlands supported rushes and sedges and amphibians and waterfowl. The dams also helped to stabilize stream flow, reducing the dramatic peak and trough hydrology that had developed in some streams after the riparian vegetation was stripped away. The hydrologists who were measuring these effects described changes in channel width, bank stability, and water temperature at sites where riparian vegetation had recovered. The rivers were, in a meaningful physical sense, being reshaped. The process was slow, and the changes were modest rather than dramatic. But they were real, and they were directly traceable, through a chain of causation that ran from wolf hunting behavior, through elk spatial decisions, through vegetation recovery, through bank stabilization, to changes in the physical form of the river. This chain of causation is what makes the Yellowstone wolf story so scientifically compelling. It is not just that wolves eat elk and elk populations decline. It is that wolf predation risk, even when it does not result in actual kills, changes the spatial behavior of elk at a fine geographic scale. And that behavioral change cascades through the ecosystem in ways that affect plants, beavers, songbirds, fish, insects, and ultimately the physical structure of the landscape itself. The concept of non-lethal effects of predators, sometimes called the ecology of fear, has become one of the most active areas of research in predator-prey biology over the past 2 decades, and Yellowstone has been central to that research. The key insight is that predators do not affect prey populations only by killing prey. They affect prey by creating risk, and prey respond to risk by changing their behavior in ways that have costs. An elk that spends more time vigilant and less time grazing may be safer from wolves, but it is also eating less. An elk that avoids the lush vegetation of the riparian zone to reduce predation risk is trading foraging quality for safety. Over a lifetime, these costs accumulate. They affect body condition, reproductive success, survival probability. The prey are always making trade-offs. And the predators, simply by existing, by hunting, by establishing territories and hunting corridors, are constantly reshaping the terms of those trade-offs across the landscape. At Yellowstone, researchers found that they could detect these trade-offs in the GPS data with remarkable precision. They could identify not just which parts of the landscape elk avoided, but when they avoided them. Time of day mattered, season mattered, pack activity mattered. An area that was avoided at dawn when wolves were most active might be used cautiously at midday. A crossing that was dangerous during the Druid Pack's peak years might be used again, tentatively, after the pack declined. The landscape of fear was not a fixed map. It was a dynamic, constantly updated assessment of risk in time and space. This temporal dimension of the landscape of fear is one of the reasons it took researchers so long to fully characterize. Early studies looked at spatial avoidance averaged across entire seasons or years. That averaging smoothed out the fine-grained temporal variation that turned out to be so important. It was only when researchers began analyzing GPS location data at hourly resolution, or finer, that the full complexity of elk spatial decision-making became visible. And it was that fine-grained temporal analysis that made it possible to link specific changes in elk crossing behavior to specific changes in pack activity. When the Druid Pack made a major kill near the river and then spent several days in the vicinity of the kill, elk avoidance of nearby crossing points spiked dramatically. When the pack moved to a different part of their territory, elk avoidance at those same crossings relaxed slightly, though never entirely. The elk were tracking the wolves, not perfectly, not in real time, but with an accuracy and consistency that spoke to the depth of their landscape knowledge and the sophistication of their risk assessment. How do elk track wolves? In part, through direct observation. Elk have excellent vision, and they watch. They have seen wolves often enough in Yellowstone's open landscapes to know what they look like and what their presence means. But they also use scent, and they use sound, and they use the behavior of other elk. A herd animal watches its neighbors as much as it watches the horizon. If the elk on the other side of the valley are suddenly running, that information propagates through the herd instantly. If the willows along a certain stretch of bank carry wolf scent that is less than 12 hours old, no elk will approach them. Wolves know this, and they use it. Scent marking is not just social communication within the pack. It is also a tool of territory management in relation to prey. A well-scent marked territory boundary is a boundary that elk will respect. reducing the energy the pack needs to spend actively patrolling and chasing to maintain their hunting advantage. Some researchers have argued that wolves engage in what might be called active landscape management, deliberately distributing scent marks in ways that funnel prey toward ambush sites or away from escape terrain. Whether wolves are truly strategic about this in a conscious sense, or whether the pattern emerges from simpler behaviors accumulated over evolutionary time, is a question that behavioral ecologists continue to debate. What is clear is that the spatial patterns of wolf scent marking and elk avoidance are not independent. They are co-evolved responses to each other, part of an ancient arms race between hunter and hunted that plays out across the landscape of every wilderness where these species have coexisted. Yellowstone gave that arms race a new arena in 1995, and the landscape has been registering the results ever since. One of the most telling pieces of evidence for the river route change came not from vegetation surveys or GPS tracking, but from aerial photography. Researchers compared aerial images of the Lamar River Valley taken in the late 1980s, before the reintroduction, with images taken in the mid-2000s, after a decade of wolf presence. The difference in riparian vegetation density along different sections of the bank was visible from the air. The sections that elk had been avoiding showed clear regrowth. The sections still being used as crossings showed continued browsing pressure. The pattern in the canopy matched the pattern predicted by the landscape of fear hypothesis. This visual evidence was important because it moved the argument beyond the statistical analysis of telemetry data and gave it a spatial reality that any observer could see. The river looked different. The banks looked different, and the differences tracked, at a coarse but visible scale, the distribution of wolf hunting pressure across the valley. Other lines of evidence came from the fish. Trout populations in sections of the Lamar River, where riparian vegetation had recovered, showed signs of improvement. The water was cooler because of the shade. The banks were more stable, meaning less sediment in the water and more complex underwater habitat structure. The aquatic invertebrates that trout depend on were more abundant in the recovered sections. Trout are not directly affected by wolves. They are not eaten by wolves. They do not smell wolves or hear them or see them, but they were responding to the downstream effects of wolf predation behavior filtered through elk spatial decisions and riparian vegetation dynamics. The trout in the Lamar River were, in a very real sense, living in a landscape shaped by the Druid Peak Pack. This is the full depth of what a trophic cascade means. It is not a metaphor. It is a physical reality measurable in the chemistry of the water and the bodies of the fish within it. And yet, as researchers were careful to emphasize, the picture was never simple. Not every section of the river showed recovery. Not all elk populations in the northern range showed the same degree of behavioral change. The effects were heterogeneous, patchy, dependent on local terrain and vegetation structure, and the specific history of wolf-elk interactions in each sub-area. There were parts of the park where wolves were present, but riparian vegetation showed little recovery, and researchers worked to understand why. One important factor was terrain. In open, flat areas with good sight lines, elk could detect wolves from a distance and had time to move away from riparian areas before wolves closed to dangerous proximity. In those areas, the landscape of fear was real, but the elk could manage it while still using the riparian vegetation, just more cautiously and for shorter periods. The browsing pressure was reduced but not eliminated. Vegetation recovery was partial. In more confined terrain, where ridges or dense forest limited sight lines and escape routes, elk avoided the dangerous sections more completely. The landscape of fear was more intense because the consequences of being caught were more severe. It was in these confined areas that vegetation recovery was most dramatic and most clearly attributable to elk behavioral change. This spatial variability in the cascade effects was itself an important scientific finding. It meant that you could predict, based on terrain analysis, where the wolves' effects on vegetation would be strongest and where they would be weakest. It gave the trophic cascade hypothesis a mechanistic precision that went beyond the simple observation that wolves were present and vegetation recovered. It tied specific physical landscape features to specific predicted magnitudes of the cascade effect, and when those predictions were tested against actual vegetation data, they held up. This is how science progresses in complex systems, not through single decisive experiments, but through the accumulation of consistent evidence from multiple independent lines of inquiry, each approaching the same underlying reality from a different angle. The GPS tracking data, the vegetation surveys, the aerial photography, the hydrology measurements, the fish population data, the beaver census, the terrain analysis. All of these independent datasets told a consistent story about what the wolves had done to the landscape. The story was not perfectly clean. There were gaps, uncertainties, places where the data was ambiguous, or where confounding factors made interpretation difficult. Science rarely tells perfectly clean stories about complex systems, but the overall pattern was clear, and it was strong. The wolves had changed the river routes the elk used, and by changing those routes, they had changed the river. To fully appreciate what was figured out here, you need to sit for a moment with the sheer difficulty of the scientific task involved. The researchers who worked on this were not watching a simple system. They were trying to disentangle the behavioral responses of a prey animal to a predator in a landscape shaped by geology, climate, human history, fire, and decades of ecological disruption. They were trying to isolate the specific effects of wolf predation risk on elk spatial behavior from all the other things that affect where elk go and when. They were trying to link those behavioral effects, which operate at the scale of individual animals and individual decisions, to ecosystem-level changes in vegetation, hydrology, and species composition that operate at scales of kilometers and decades. To do that, they needed data, an enormous amount of data, and they needed analytical tools capable of making sense of it. The GPS collar technology that became available in the late 1990s and early 2000s was transformative. It meant that instead of watching individual animals for a few hours from a fixed observation point, researchers could track dozens of wolves and hundreds of elk simultaneously, around the clock, in all weather, across the entire park. The dataset that this technology generated was unprecedented in predator-prey research. The analysis of that data required new statistical approaches. Traditional methods for analyzing animal movement data were designed for much sparser datasets. With GPS fixes every few hours from dozens of animals simultaneously, researchers had to develop new tools for characterizing habitat use, movement patterns, and the spatial relationships between predators and prey. Some of those tools, developed to address questions in Yellowstone, have since become standard methods in wildlife ecology broadly. The collaboration required to make sense of all this data was also substantial. No single researcher or laboratory had the expertise to handle the full range of questions the dataset raised. The Yellowstone Wolf Project brought together ecologists, mathematicians, computer scientists, hydrologists, botanists, and behavioral biologists in a sustained collaborative effort that spanned institutions and disciplines and continued for decades. The story of how this science was done is itself a story worth telling, a model of what large-scale, long-term ecological research can achieve when it is supported consistently over time. Long-term is the key phrase here. Many of the most important patterns only became visible after years or decades of observation. The initial changes in elk behavior after wolf reintroduction were visible within the first year or two, but the vegetation recovery took a decade to become clearly measurable across broad areas of the northern range. The hydrological changes took longer still. The beaver recovery took time, and then the wetlands the beavers created took further time to develop their full ecological complexity. And throughout all of this, the wolf population itself was changing, adding another layer of temporal variability to an already complex story. A study that ran for only 5 years would have seen the beginning of the behavioral changes, but would have missed most of the vegetation and hydrology story. A study that ran for 20 years could see all of it, but would also have had to grapple with the confounding effects of drought, disease, and pack turnover that occurred over that period. Only by monitoring continuously, documenting everything, and analyzing the full-time series could researchers begin to separate signal from noise and understand what the wolves had truly set in motion. This is the argument for long-term ecological research, stated as clearly as any case study could state it. Short-term research answers short-term questions. Long-term research answers the questions that matter most about how living systems actually work, about how they respond to disturbance and recover from loss, and restructure themselves when missing pieces are returned. Yellowstone has been that kind of long-term investment, and the return on it has been extraordinary. The wolves themselves, of course, did not know any of this was happening. They were not trying to restore the Lamar River, or improve conditions for trout, or bring back beavers. They were trying to eat. They were navigating the same imperatives of hunger and survival and reproduction that have driven wolves since long before there were people to watch them. They hunted where the hunting was possible. They raised pups where the terrain and the resources allowed. They defended their territory against rivals with all the ferocity their social structure could muster. They did what wolves do, and the landscape responded. The elk did not know they were participating in a trophic cascade. They were responding to danger as they had been shaped by evolution to respond, with vigilance and flight and spatial caution, and the constant, unconscious calculation of risk versus reward that every prey animal runs every waking moment of its life. They were avoiding certain river crossings not because they had analyzed the hydrology, but because something in the structure of those crossings, the sight lines, the distance to cover, the scent of wolves in the willows, registered as dangerous, and they were right to feel it. The beavers that returned to the Lamar Valley were not responding to wolves directly. They were responding to willows. The willows were there because elk had stopped eating them. The elk had stopped eating them because the wolves made it too dangerous. The beavers did not know about the wolves, and the wolves did not know about the beavers, but their lives were connected across the web of the ecosystem as surely as if they had been in direct communication. This is what ecology is, at its deepest level. It is the study of these connections, the threads of causation and response and feedback that link every species in a community to every other species, often in ways that are invisible, until something fundamental changes and the whole web shifts in response. Yellowstone, for all the complexity of its science and all the ongoing debates about specific mechanisms and magnitudes, has given us one of the clearest views we have ever had of how those threads work. The wolves changed which river route the elk used. The elk, by changing their routes, changed the river. The river, changed by the elk, changed the landscape. And the landscape, changed by everything that came before, came back to life in ways that no one who surveyed those stripped bare banks in the 1980s could have anticipated. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves careful attention before we draw it to a close, and it is perhaps the most important dimension of all. It is the question of what this story means for how we think about conservation and the management of wild places in the 21st century. The Yellowstone wolf reintroduction was controversial from the start. Ranchers feared for their livestock, hunters worried about elk populations. Politicians from Wyoming and Montana fought it in court for years. The debate was intense, and it was real, rooted in genuine economic concerns and genuine differences in values about what wild land is for and who gets to decide how it is managed. Those debates have not gone away. The wolves that leave the protection of Yellowstone's boundaries, as wolves inevitably do given that they cannot read park signs, continue to create conflict with livestock producers in the surrounding states. The management of wolves outside the park remains deeply contentious. The politics of predator conservation in the American West are as fraught today as they were in the 1990s. But the science from Yellowstone has added something important to those debates. It has demonstrated, with a rigor and a specificity that was not previously available, that large predators do things to ecosystems that go far beyond the direct effects of their predation on prey populations. It has shown that the mere presence of a functioning predator, the mere risk it creates, reshapes the behavior of prey across entire landscapes in ways that affect dozens of other species and the physical structure of the land and water itself. This means that the question of whether to have wolves is not simply a question of whether you want more or fewer elk, or whether you are willing to accept some livestock losses. It is a question about what kind of ecosystem you want, about what rivers should look like, and whether beavers should exist, and whether trout should thrive, and what songbirds should fill the willows along the water. It is a question about the full depth and complexity of the living world, and